The recycled air tasted of ozone and regret, a sterile tang that coated the back of Elian's throat. He drew it in slowly, a measured breath, just as he did everything. Measure the air, measure the dose, measure the tremor in his own hands as he pressed the hypospray against the thin skin of his wrist. The hiss was a whisper of betrayal against the deeper, ever-present hum of the freighter's life support. He held it there a moment longer than necessary, the cold metallic circle a familiar punishment. The serum flooded his veins, a chemical blanket smothering a fire he was not permitted to acknowledge. He was not a weakness. He was not a liability. He was Sub-Lieutenant Elian Verus, third in command on the Stellar-class freighter Stargazer, designation 734, a number, a rank, a carefully constructed wall of ice and efficiency around a core of molten secret. The ship shuddered, a low groan of stressed metal that vibrated up through the deck plates, through the soles of his boots, and into his bones. It was a familiar language, the groans and sighs of an aging vessel pushed far beyond its intended limits. He knew its every ache, every stutter in the plasma conduits, every flicker of the emergency lighting in the narrow corridors. He knew it better than he knew himself, because the ship was a simple machine of physics and engineering. It could be understood. It could be controlled. Himself. He was a cascade of biology he spent every waking moment trying to conquer. The door to his cramped quarters chimed, a polite, electronic sound that felt jarringly out of place in the grimy reality of the ship. "Enter," he said, his voice flat. He capped the hypospray and slid it back into the hidden compartment in his medkit. The motion was fluid, practiced over a decade of concealment. The door slid open to reveal Beta crewman Aris, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat, his uniform rumpled. Aris was a good man, earnest and perpetually overwhelmed, a mirror of what Elian might have been in another life, a life without the lie. "Sub-Lieutenant," Aris stammered, his eyes wide. "Message from the bridge. It's the fleet." Elian felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. The fleet. Not a patrol, not a lone destroyer on a supply run. The fleet meant the full, terrifying majesty of the hegemony's military power. It meant flagships and battle cruisers and the unblinking judgment of high command. And it meant alphas, an entire ecosystem of them, radiating confidence and command, and a pheromonal certainty that scraped his nerves raw, even through the suppressants. "Specify, crewman." His tone was clipped, betraying nothing. Aris swallowed, his gaze darting around Elian's Spartan quarters as if seeking an escape. "It's the Third Fleet, sir. The Vanguard. Admiral Vance's command." The name landed in the small cabin with the weight of a collapsing star. Admiral Kalen Vance, the Iron Admiral, a living legend, a strategic genius whose victories were taught at the Academy as gospel, a man infamous for his discipline, his perfectionism, and his publicly stated, deeply entrenched belief that Omegas were a biological vulnerability, a subgender unsuited for the rigors of military service. Omegas don't belong on ships. The words, spoken during a Senate hearing and broadcast across the sector, had become a rallying cry for traditionalists and a death knell for the ambitions of the few Omegas who, like Elian, dared to dream of the stars. Elian had watched that broadcast 100 times, the Admiral's calm, handsome face a mask of conviction, his voice a steady, resonant baritone delivering a verdict on Elian's entire existence. A vulnerability, a distraction, a risk. Elian pressed his fingers against the cool metal of his desk, the pressure grounding him. He was not a risk. He had scrubbed every trace of his designation from his life. He had trained twice as hard, studied twice as long, suppressed every instinct until his own body felt like a foreign country. He was a tactician, a navigator, a pilot. He was an asset. He was not an Omega. He had willed it out of existence. "And their disposition?" Elian asked, his voice a ghost of its usual command. "They're holding position at the edge of the nebula, sir. Standard formation. They've hailed us. Captain requires you on the bridge." Of course he did. Captain Ava Rostova, a weary beta who saw Elian's talent but was too cowed by regulation to ever truly champion him, relied on his quick thinking for anything more complex than charting a course. Elian nodded once. "Acknowledged. Dismissed, Aris." The crewman practically fled, the door hissing shut behind him. Alone again, Elian stood in the silence, the ship's hum a low thrum against his skull. He looked at his reflection in the darkened monitor of his workstation. The face that stared back was pale, sharp-boned, with eyes the color of a winter sky. There were shadows beneath them, etched by sleepless nights and constant vigilance. He saw Sub-Lieutenant Verus, the cold, capable officer. He did not see the boy who had once been told his only value lay in bearing alpha children. He did not see the terror that lived in his blood, the fear of a single dropped dose, a single moment of weakness. Admiral Vance, here, in his sector. The universe had a dark, ironic sense of humor. He smoothed down the front of his uniform, the fabric stiff and reassuring. He adjusted the collar, ensuring the fit was precise, severe. He was a series of straight lines and sharp angles, nothing soft, nothing yielding. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a weapon of his own making, honed by denial. And he would not break, not even for the Iron Admiral himself. He walked out of his quarters and into the narrow, dimly lit corridor, the scent of ozone and recycled air clinging to him, like a shroud. The deck plates vibrated beneath his boots, a steady, rhythmic pulse. The heartbeat of the machine. It was the only heart he allowed himself to hear. The bridge of the Stargazer was a study in controlled chaos, a state it had maintained for the better part of 3 hours. The air, thick with the metallic scent of burnt wiring and the acrid tang of fear sweat, crackled with shouted reports and the frantic clicking of consoles. Red alert strobes painted the scene in rhythmic, bloody flashes, catching the glint of terror in the eyes of the skeleton crew. Elian moved through it all with an unnatural calm, a small, still point in the storm. His station, the tactical console, was a wreck of shattered glass and sparking conduits, the result of the first volley from the pirate corvette that had ambushed them out of the nebula's gaseous skirts. He was working from a secondary terminal, its screen flickering, his fingers flying across the controls as he rerouted power from non-essential systems, trying to coax one last gasp from their failing shields. "Aft shields at 12%, someone yelled. "We've lost main propulsion. Inertial dampeners are offline." The ship lurched violently, throwing Aris against a bulkhead with a sickening crunch. The red lights gave way to the stark, terrifying darkness of total power failure, punctuated by the shower of sparks from a ruptured ceiling panel. In the blackness, the only sounds were ragged breathing and a low, keening moan of pain. "Emergency power," Elian's voice cut through the panic, cold and clear as ice. "Rostova, now." Captain Rostova, clutching the arm of her command chair, her face a mask of shock, seemed to break from her stupor. "Do it," she choked out. A moment later, the bridge was bathed in the dim, blood-red glow of the emergency system. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Elian's eyes were already adjusted, scanning the sputtering terminal. The pirate's ship was a brutal, ugly thing, a retrofitted asteroid miner bristling with scavenged weaponry. They had been outgunned and outmaneuvered from the start. A simple cargo run turned into a death trap. "They're hailing us," the comms officer reported, his voice trembling. "They demand our surrender and our cargo." Rostova looked at Elian, her eyes pleading. Surrender was a death sentence. These were scavengers, not soldiers. They would take the cargo, kill the crew, and space the ship. "Their forward weapon ports are open," Elian said, ignoring the hail. His gaze was fixed on the tactical display, a schematic of the enemy vessel. He was processing variables, running calculations with a speed that was not entirely human. He saw the flicker of their shield modulation, the power spike in their primary cannon. He saw the window. It was infinitesimally small, a gamble that would either save them or atomize them. "Captain," he said, turning to her, "they're preparing to fire. We have one chance. We have to vent the primary plasma conduit." Rostova stared at him, aghast. "Veras, that's insane. That's our main power line. If we vent it, we'll be dead in the water, completely." "We are already dead in the water, Captain," Elian countered, his tone hardening. "They expect us to surrender or fight. They don't expect us to commit suicide." He pointed to the nebula on the main view screen, its swirling clouds of hydrogen and stellar dust now looking less like a navigational hazard and more like a sanctuary. "The conduit runs along the port side. If we vent it directly as they fire, the escaping plasma will ignite. The explosion will be catastrophic. It will blind their senses, and, if I can time it with a burst from the maneuvering thrusters, it will push us back into the nebula's magnetic field. They won't be able to follow. They'll think we self-destructed." It was a plan born of desperation and cold, hard physics. A plan no sane, by-the-book officer would ever conceive. It was beautiful in its suicidal logic. Rostova hesitated, her face a war of terror and indecision. The ship shuddered again as another, smaller blast impacted their hull. The decision was made for her. "Do it, Sub-Lieutenant," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "May the stars forgive us." Elian didn't need forgiveness. He needed precision. He moved to the engineering console, shoving the terrified ensign aside. His hands danced over the controls, bypassing safety protocols, overriding emergency shutdowns. The ship screamed in protest, alarms blaring a cacophony of doom. On the view screen, the pirate ship's cannon began to glow, a malevolent blue eye opening to pass judgment. Venting conduit in 3, 2. Elian watched the energy signature on his screen. His entire consciousness narrowed to that single point of data, that one sliver of time. The blue light on the enemy ship intensified, reaching its peak. "Now!" He slammed his palm down on the release valve control. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the port side of the Stargazer erupted in a silent, brilliant flare of white-hot plasma. The view screen went white. The ship screamed, not a groan of metal, but the shriek of a soul being torn apart. A violent, bone-jarring force threw Elian from his feet. He hit the deck hard, his head cracking against the base of the command chair. The world dissolved into a smear of red light and overwhelming pain. Through the roaring in his ears, he thought he heard a new voice, a calm, authoritative voice cutting through the chaos on the comms, a voice he recognized from 100 broadcasts. It was a phantom, a hallucination of his oxygen-deprived brain. But the words were clear. This is Admiral Vance of the hegemony flagship Ethelgard to the unidentified vessel. Cease your attack immediately. You are in violation of fleet ordinance. Power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded. A pause. Then, the pirate ship, its sensors likely blinded, and its crew in disarray from the unexpected. Plasma detonation fired its main cannon into the empty space where the stargazer had been a moment before. Elian felt a faint ghost of a push as the last of his plan fell into place. The maneuvering thrusters, firing their pre-programmed sequence, nudged their crippled, dying ship backward into the safety of the nebula's electromagnetic interference. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the tactical display. A single, beautiful green icon representing the Ethelgard appearing on the edge of the screen. A silent, avenging angel arriving just a moment too late and a moment too soon. He had saved them. He had also, he suspected, just sealed his own fate. The Iron Admiral had a front-row seat to his madness. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a series of sharp, distinct sensations. The sterile, antiseptic scent of a medical bay, the low, rhythmic beep of a vital signs monitor, a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to originate from the back of his skull and radiate through his entire body. And light, a clean, white, unforgiving light that pierced his eyelids. He forced them open, squinting against the glare. He was in a bio-bed, the kind used on fleet vessels, far more advanced than anything on the Stargazer. A transparent canopy hummed softly above him. He was alone. He tried to sit up, but a wave of nausea and pain forced him back down against the cool, gel-like surface of the bed. He took a breath, then another, measuring the air, cataloguing his injuries. Head trauma, bruised ribs, likely a concussion. Nothing he hadn't endured before. But the true injury was the cold dread coiling in his stomach. He was on a fleet ship. He was on Admiral Vance's ship. The door to the med bay slid open with a near-silent hiss. A man stood silhouetted against the brighter light of the corridor. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform a crisp, immaculate black, adorned with the silver insignia of a flag officer. He stepped inside, and the door slid shut behind him, plunging the room into a more subdued light. Admiral Kalen Vance moved with an unnerving economy of motion, his presence filling the sterile space with an aura of absolute authority. His face was exactly as it appeared in the broadcasts: strong jaw, piercing grey eyes, hair the colour of iron filings threaded with silver at the temples. It was a face carved from granite and disapproval. He stopped beside the bio-bed, his gaze sweeping over Elian, analytical and cold. It was the look of a scientist examining a curious specimen, not a commander assessing a fellow officer. Sub-Lieutenant Elian Veras, Vance said. His voice was a low baritone, calm and resonant, with no trace of warmth. It was the voice that had condemned him. "You are aboard the hegemony flagship Ethelgard." Elian found his own voice, surprised at its hoarseness. "Admiral." He managed to push himself up onto his elbows, the effort sending a fresh wave of pain through his head. He would not be interrogated lying down. "Captain Rostova? The crew?" "Captain Rostova is stable. Of your crew of 27, 23 survived, thanks to your unconventional maneuver." The word hung in the air, weighted with judgment. Unconventional. Not brilliant. Not resourceful. Just a deviation from the norm. "The pirate vessel has been neutralized," Vance's eyes narrowed slightly. "The logs from your ship are corrupted, a side effect of venting your entire power system. I find myself in the unenviable position of having to rely on your report. Tell me exactly what happened." Elian recounted the events of the ambush, his voice a dry monotone. He stripped the narrative of all emotion, presenting only the facts, the tactical variables, the cold logic of his decision. He spoke of shield frequencies and weapon yields, and the precise timing required to turn a self-destruct sequence into a propulsion mechanism. He did not speak of the fear, the desperation, the certainty of death. He presented himself as a machine, a calculator. Vance listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Elian finished, a long silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady beep of the monitor. The Admiral's gaze was intense, probing, as if he were trying to see past the uniform, past the carefully constructed facade. Elian felt a primal urge to shrink away from that gaze, a deep-seated instinct he had spent his life crushing. He held his ground, meeting the Admiral's eyes, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Your solution was reckless, illogical, and in direct violation of at least 17 fleet protocols," Vance stated finally, his voice flat. "It was also, regrettably, successful." He paused, his gaze drifting to the vital signs monitor beside the bed. Elian followed his look. His heart rate was elevated, his respiration was shallow. Signs of stress, signs of weakness. He forced himself to calm down, to slow the frantic rhythm in his chest. "My first mate, Commander Thorne, was killed during the initial exchange when we engaged the pirates," Vance continued, his tone unchanging, as if he were discussing a minor logistical issue. "He was a fine officer, an alpha of impeccable breeding and discipline." The emphasis was subtle, but it was a blade aimed directly at Elian. The Ethel Guard requires a first mate. Fleet regulations in a combat zone dictate that in the absence of a suitable alpha candidate from the existing crew, command can be supplemented by an officer of merit from an auxiliary vessel. Elian's blood ran cold. He knew the regulation. It was an archaic rule, rarely invoked, a relic from a time when merit was occasionally allowed to outweigh designation. He saw where this was going, and it was a place of exquisite, terrifying irony. "Your tactical acumen, while dangerously unorthodox, is undeniable," Vance said, his voice laced with something that might have been distaste. "You saved your crew. You disabled an enemy vessel indirectly. By the letter of the law, you are the most qualified officer in this sector to fill the position." He looked back at Elian, his grey eyes like chips of ice. "Effective immediately, Sub-Lieutenant Verus, you are assigned to this vessel. You will serve as my acting first mate until we reach sector command." The words were an order, a promotion, a death sentence. Elian felt the carefully constructed walls of his life begin to crack. To serve under this man, to be subjected to his constant, unforgiving scrutiny on the bridge of the flagship, was a nightmare made manifest. Every moment would be a test, every breath a risk. The suppressants, the lies, the sheer force of will required to maintain his disguise, it would all be stretched to its breaking point. "I understand, Admiral," Elian heard himself say, his voice a stranger's. The Admiral gave a curt nod, a gesture of dismissal. "The medical officer will clear you for duty in 2 hours. Your uniform will be provided. Do not be late for your first shift." He turned and walked out of the med bay without another word, the door hissing shut behind him, leaving Elian alone in the sterile silence. He stared at the closed door, the beeping of the monitor suddenly deafening in his ears. He was not a weakness. He was not a liability. He was the first mate of the HFS Ethelgard. He was a dead man, walking. The bridge of the Ethelgard was less a command center and more a cathedral consecrated to the god of order. Polished chrome and dark, matte grey metal gleamed under recessed lighting that cast no shadows. The air was cool and still, filtered to an almost impossible purity, carrying only the faintest scent of ozone and electricity. It was silent, save for the whisper-quiet hum of the quantum computer core and the soft, deferential tones of the bridge crew. They were all alphas, Elian noted immediately. A collection of perfect specimens, their uniforms immaculate, their postures radiating the easy confidence of those born to rule. They moved with a quiet, synchronized grace, a ballet of military precision. And they were all watching him. As he stepped onto the command deck, a ripple of awareness passed through the room. Conversations ceased, heads turned. He could feel their eyes on him, a physical weight of curiosity and suspicion. He was an outsider, a low-ranking officer from a freighter, a beta in their rarefied world, or so they thought. His new uniform, a crisp admiral's black with the silver bars of a first mate, felt like a costume. He kept his expression neutral, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed straight ahead on the single figure standing before the main view screen. Admiral Vance stood with his hands clasped behind his back, observing the starfield before them. The starfield itself was a breathtaking spectacle of cosmic dust and nascent stars, but Vance seemed to see only the tactical implications, the potential threats hiding in the beauty. He did not turn as Elian approached. "Report," Vance said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "First Mate Verus, reporting for duty as ordered." "Admiral," Elian said, his voice steady. He stopped precisely 2 paces behind the Admiral's right shoulder, the regulation distance. Vance remained silent for a long moment, forcing Elian to stand there, an object of scrutiny for the entire bridge. It was a power play, a deliberate demonstration of the hierarchy. Elian did not fidget. He did not breathe too loudly. He simply stood, a statue of compliance, waiting. "The crew has been briefed on your temporary assignment," Vance said finally, turning his head just enough to regard Elian from the corner of his eye. "They are curious. Your performance aboard the Stargazer has become something of a legend in the mess hall. They call it the Vera's Gambit." There was no approval in his tone. "Ensure your performance here warrants their attention." "I will, Admiral. Your station is to my left. You will monitor all incoming tactical data, coordinate with fleet auxiliaries, and provide me with concise, relevant analysis. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not offer an opinion unless it is solicited. Is that clear?" "Crystal, Admiral." It was a leash, and they both knew it. He was not a partner. He was a tool, a temporary component in the Admiral's perfect machine. A component that would be watched for the slightest sign of defect. Vance gave a curt nod and turned his attention back to the view screen. "Helm, set a course for the Citadel. Warp Factor 5, engage." "Engaging, Admiral," the helm officer replied, his voice a deep, respectful rumble. The ship gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shudder as it slipped into warp. The stars on the view screen elongated into streaks of white and blue light, a tunnel into hyperspace. Elian moved to his station, a gleaming console to the left of the command chair. The interface was state-of-the-art, a dozen times more complex than the one on the Stargazer. Data streams flowed across the screens in elegant, color-coded lines. Fleet positions, energy signatures, long-range sensor sweeps. It was an ocean of information, and he was expected to navigate it flawlessly. He submerged himself in the data, the numbers and symbols, a welcome refuge. Here there was no subtext, no judgment, only logic. He could parse fleet formations, calculate weapon trajectories, analyze sensor ghosts. He could be the officer they believed him to be. The first few hours of the shift passed in a tense, disciplined silence. Elian worked with methodical efficiency, absorbing the rhythm of the bridge, the quiet confidence of the crew. He flagged a sensor anomaly from a passing comet, rerouted a communication relay that was experiencing interference, and cross-referenced a patrol report from a scout ship. He did it all silently, forwarding the relevant data to the Admiral's personal console with brief clinical notations. He could feel Vance's awareness of him, a constant, low-level pressure at the edge of his senses. The Admiral never looked at him directly, but Elian knew he was being observed, his every action weighed and measured. The pressure was a physical thing, a tightening in his chest, a strain on the chemical walls he had built around himself. The dose of suppressant he had taken in the med bay was strong, designed for long-term stability, but the constant, low-grade stress was like water wearing away at stone. A faint, almost undetectable scent began to tickle the back of his own nose, the sweet, rain-washed scent of ozone and blooming nightshade that was his own, a scent he hadn't smelled in years. It was a ghost, a phantom, but it was there. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his composure. He subtly adjusted the environmental controls at his station, increasing the flow of filtered air around him, hoping to dissipate the phantom before it became a reality. He focused on the data streams, forcing his heart rate down, willing the chemical chains in his blood to hold. Kalen Vance stood on his command deck, a bastion of control in a universe of chaos. He felt the subtle shift in the ship's systems as it entered warp, the familiar thrum of power that was as comforting to him as a heartbeat. His bridge was a sanctuary of order, his crew a hand-picked selection of the best the fleet had to offer. Every element was in its place, every variable accounted for, except for one. The man standing at the tactical station to his left was an anomaly, a discordant note in the perfect symphony of his command. Sub-Lieutenant Elian Veras. Kalen had reviewed the man's file. It was sparse, almost suspiciously so. Graduated top 5% from a minor off-world academy. Service record was flawless, but unremarkable. A string of postings on freighters and supply runners. No commendations, no disciplinary actions. A career of calculated mediocrity. It didn't align with the man who had calmly executed a maneuver of such suicidal brilliance. It was the act of a gambler, a genius, or a madman. Kalen was not yet sure which, and there was something else, something that disturbed him on a level he couldn't articulate. A dissonance in the man's presence. He was listed as a beta, and he had the quiet, unassuming demeanor of one. Yet there was an intensity in his pale eyes, a coiled tension in his posture that spoke of something more, a tightly leashed power. Kalen prided himself on his ability to read people, to understand the motivations that drove them. But Veras was a closed book, a cipher. As the hours passed, Kalen watched him. He saw the way Veras absorbed the complex data streams of the Ethelgard's systems without a flicker of hesitation. He saw the economy of his movements, the precision of his reports. The man was unnervingly competent. He was an asset. And yet, Kalen could not shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. It was a scent, or the absence of one. The alphas on his bridge had distinct pheromonal signatures: confidence, aggression, focus, which Kalen could filter and ignore. The recycled air of the ship was a neutral canvas, but from Verus there was nothing. A void, a chemical blankness that was more unnatural than any scent. It was like looking at a man in a vacuum. Then a subtle shift, a change in the air so faint that for a moment Kalen thought he had imagined it. A trace of something sweet and clean, like the air after a storm, undercut with a darker, wilder note. It was alien, yet disturbingly familiar. It pricked at the edges of his consciousness, distracting him. He saw Verus subtly increase the airflow at his station. The scent vanished. Kalen's eyes narrowed. The action was too casual to be suspicious to anyone else, but to Kalen, who missed nothing, it was a deliberate act of concealment. What was he hiding? A forbidden substance? An illness? The uncertainty was a flaw in his perfect system, an irritant. He would find out. He would dissect this sub-lieutenant Verus, uncover his secrets, and restore order to his ship. He was Admiral Kalen Vance. Control was not just his profession, it was his nature, and he would not tolerate a rogue variable on his own bridge. The shift change offered a brief respite. As the new crew filed onto the bridge, their fresh energy a stark contrast to the tense stillness of the past 8 hours, Elian felt a fraction of the pressure on him ease. He compiled his final report, a concise summary of their warp transit and sensor readings, and sent it to the Admiral's console. He stood, his muscles stiff from the forced stillness. "Permission to be relieved, Admiral," he said, his voice a low monotone. Vance, who had been conversing quietly with the incoming Alpha who would take Elian's station, turned to him. His grey eyes were unreadable, but Elian felt their weight, the lingering scrutiny. "You are not relieved, First Mate," Vance said, his voice carrying easily across the now bustling bridge. "You will accompany me to the ready room. There are strategic matters to discuss." A murmur went through the nearby crew. The Admiral's ready room was sanctum sanctorum, a place reserved for his most trusted senior officers. To be summoned there on his first day was either a great honor or a prelude to an execution. With Elian, it felt like the latter. "Yes, Admiral." He fell into step behind Vance, following him off the main bridge and toward a heavy blast door that hissed open at their approach. The ready room was a stark, minimalist space, dominated by a large, obsidian-black table that doubled as a holographic projector. One wall was a reinforced window, looking out into the swirling vortex of hyperspace. The only other features were 2 severe-looking chairs and a replicator set into the wall. The door slid shut behind them, sealing them in a profound, intimidating silence. Vance walked to the window, his back to Elian, and stared out at the streaking lights of the warp corridor. "The Vera's gambit," he said, into the silence, his voice a low rumble. "Tell me how you conceived of it." It was not a question. It was a demand. A test. Elian stood at attention in the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "It was a matter of available resources versus immediate threat, Admiral. The pirate's weapon signature indicated a charge time of 4.7 seconds. Our shields were projected to fail in 3.2. Surrender was not a viable option. Evasive maneuvers were impossible without main propulsion. The only remaining variable under my control was our own ship's power core. He spoke like a machine reciting a report, deliberately stripping the desperation from the memory. You calculated the explosive yield of a plasma conduit rupture and its propulsive effect while under enemy fire. The base formula is simple physics, Admiral. The variables were the challenge. You gambled the lives of your entire crew on a simple physics formula. Vance turned from the window, his expression severe. I calculated their best chance of survival. The odds of surviving a direct hit were 0. The odds of surviving surrender were negligible. The odds of my plan succeeding were approximately 17%. It was the only logical choice. Vance stared at him, a long, unnerving silence stretching between them. Elian felt a bead of cold sweat trickle down his spine. The air in the small room was thick with the Admiral's presence, an oppressive weight of pure, undiluted alpha authority. It was a physical force, pressing in on him, testing the limits of his suppressants. He could feel the ghost of his own scent trying to claw its way to the surface, a desperate, traitorous response to the overwhelming dominance in the room. He clenched his fists behind his back, his nails digging into his palms. He was not weak. He would not break. 17%, Vance repeated softly, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He moved to the replicator. Coffee? The question was so unexpected, so mundane, that it threw Elian off balance. Sir? Coffee. Black, Vance said, his back to him as he keyed in the command. It will be a long night. We need to review the pirate faction's territorial claims in this quadrant. Their attack on the Stargazer was too bold, too organized for common scavengers. A cup materialized in the replicator's alcove with a soft chime. Vance took it, then turned and looked at Elian. Well, do you require a written invitation, First Mate? The use of his new title felt like another test. Elian hesitated for a fraction of a second before moving to the replicator. Coffee, Black, he said, his voice tight. He took the cup, the heat a small grounding reality in the surreal tension of the room. He did not drink it. He stood waiting. Vance moved to the large table, placing his cup down. With a gesture, he activated the holographic display. A three-dimensional map of the sector bloomed into life in the center of the room, a swirl of star systems, shipping lanes, and nebulae. Red icons pulsed ominously in several systems. These are the reported pirate attacks from the last 3 months, Vance said, his voice all business now. Disorganized, hit-and-run tactics, targeting isolated transports. But this, he gestured, and the attack on the Stargazer appeared, a fresh, angry, red icon, is different. A military-grade corvette, disciplined fire patterns, and a strategically chosen ambush point. This was not scavenging. This was a targeted strike. He looked at Elian, his grey eyes sharp. Your cargo manifest lists standard agricultural equipment and medical supplies. Nothing worth this level of risk. So they were either after something not on the manifest, or they were trying to send a message. Which is it? Elian stared at the holographic map, his mind racing. He forced the panic down, channeling it into tactical analysis. This was familiar territory, data, strategy. He could do this. The nebula, Admiral, the ambush point. It's a natural sensor blind, but it's also on a direct vector to the Inaris system. Inaris is a hegemony listening post, a black site. Officially, it doesn't exist. He looked up from the map, meeting Vance's intense gaze. They weren't attacking us. They were using us to draw out the fleet, to draw you out. The silence that followed was different. It was not the silence of judgment, but of consideration. Kalen watched the younger man, saw the flicker of insight in his pale eyes. The conclusion was the same one Kalen's own intelligence team had taken 6 hours to reach. Veras had done it in less than a minute. The man's mind was a dangerously sharp weapon, but it was the other things that held Kalen's attention. The rigid control in Veras's posture, the way he held his coffee cup but didn't drink, as if it were a prop, and that scent, that fleeting, almost imperceptible scent. It was stronger in the enclosed space of the ready room. Ozone and nightshade. It was an Omega scent. Kalen knew it with a certainty that went deeper than thought. He had encountered it before, on diplomatic missions, in civilian sectors. It was the scent of heat, of fertility, of a biology he had deemed incompatible with the cold, hard logic of war. His mind reeled. An Omega, here, on his bridge, serving as his first mate. The sheer, audacious impossibility of it was staggering. Every regulation, every protocol, every core belief he held was being violated. The man's entire career was a lie, a brilliant, meticulously crafted lie. The deception was infuriating. It was a flaw in the system, a crack in the foundation of order. He should have Veras arrested, court-martialed, stripped of his rank, and sent to the nearest reprocessing facility. It was his duty. But the 17% solution, the instant analysis of the tactical situation, the mind that saw the patterns no one else did. He was not an asset. He was a weapon that had been forged in defiance of the very system Kalen upheld. A cold, calculating part of his mind, the part that had won him so many battles, whispered a dangerous thought. What if the flaw was not in the man, but in the system? He looked at Elian, who stood perfectly still, unaware that his deepest secret was laid bare. Kalen's expression remained a mask of stone. He would not reveal his knowledge. Not yet. This rogue variable was too interesting. He would observe. He would analyze. He would see how long the lie could be maintained under the pressure of his command. "Your theory is plausible, First Mate," Kalen said, his voice betraying nothing of the storm in his mind. "Expand on it. Give me a projection. What is their next move?" He was not just testing the officer anymore. He was testing the Omega. He was testing the foundations of his own world. And a part of him, a dark, rebellious part he had long suppressed, was curious to see which would break first. The mission devolved into a tense, protracted hunt. For 3 weeks, the Ethel Guard patrolled the sector, a predator stalking a ghost. The pirates, or whoever they were, had vanished back into the void, leaving behind only the mystery of their attack and the simmering tension on the flagship's bridge. For Elian, it was a slow, grinding torture. He lived in a state of hyper-vigilance, every moment an exercise in control. He slept in 4-hour increments, his dreams filled with the scent of ozone and the cold, grey eyes of the Admiral. He ate alone in his quarters, unable to stomach the casual camaraderie of the mess hall, the boisterous confidence of the alphas. His only refuge was his work. He excelled at it. He streamlined the bridge's reporting protocols, optimized sensor sweep patterns, and developed a predictive algorithm for tracking subspace anomalies that earned him a grudging nod of approval from the ship's science officer. He was a perfect machine, efficient and silent. But the machine was breaking down. The stress was a constant, abrasive force against his suppressants. The chemical walls were thinning. He had to increase his dosage, first by a small fraction, then by a quarter, then by a third. The higher dose left him feeling hollowed out,
his emotions blunted, his senses muted. It was a necessary price for survival. The phantom scent was becoming more frequent, a traitorous whisper he was constantly fighting to silence. He took to carrying a small, personal atmospheric filter, a device he claimed was for allergies, activating it whenever he felt the telltale tingle in his blood. It was a flimsy excuse, but no one questioned him. No one dared. He was the Admiral's man, a strange, cold fixture on the bridge, and the crew gave him a wide, respectful berth. His relationship with Vance remained a formal, unreadable ballet of command and obedience. They spent hours together in the ready room, poring over star charts and intelligence reports. The Admiral would push him, testing his logic, challenging his conclusions. Elian would respond with cold, unassailable data. There was no warmth, no camaraderie, but a strange, sterile intimacy began to form between them. The connection of two powerful intellects focused on a single problem. During one late-night strategy session, while tracing the pirates' possible escape vectors through a dense asteroid field, the ship's systems suddenly flickered. The lights on the bridge dimmed for a second, and the holographic map wavered. A low-level alarm chimed through the ship. "Report," Vance's voice cut through the quiet hum of the ready room. The comm crackled. "Admiral, we're reading a massive gravimetric distortion off the port bow. Source is unknown. It's pulling at us." Elian was already at the room's secondary console, his fingers flying. "It's a rogue singularity, Admiral. A micro-black hole. Uncharted. Its event horizon is expanding." On the main screen, a patch of space that had been empty moments before was now a swirling vortex of distorted light. "Helm, full reverse," Vance commanded, his voice sharp with authority. "Engineering, divert all available power to the engines." The deck tilted as the powerful engines of the Ethel Guard fought against the invisible tide of gravity. A deep, groaning protest echoed through the ship's structure. "It's no good, Admiral." The chief engineer's voice came over the comm, strained. "The gravitational pull is too strong. We're caught." Panic, a cold, familiar serpent, coiled in Elian's gut. He crushed it down. Panic was a luxury. He looked at the data streaming across his console. The singularity's mass, its rotational speed, the stress on the ship's hull. The numbers were grim. The ship was being torn apart. The structural integrity field was fluctuating wildly. Alphas, for all their strength and command, were often rigid thinkers. They met force with force, but this was not a force you could fight. It was a force you had to outwit. And in the spiraling data, Elian saw it again. A sliver of a chance, a 17% solution. "Admiral," he said, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "Fighting it is useless. We have to use its own momentum. The singularity is rotating clockwise. If we angle our port shields to full power and vent drive plasma from the starboard nacelle, we can use the gravitational shear to slingshot ourselves around it." Vance turned to look at him, his face a mask of stone. The bridge crew, listening in on the command channel, fell silent. The plan was audacious, counterintuitive. It meant turning the ship closer to the thing that was killing them. It meant trusting Elian's insane, desperate brand of logic. "The stress on the hull would be immense," the chief engineer protested over the comm. "We could be torn in half." "We will be torn in half if we do nothing," Elian countered, his voice ringing with an authority he didn't know he possessed. "The window is closing.
We have less than a minute before the sheer forces become unsurvivable. Kalen stared at Elian. The man's pale face was illuminated by the flickering console lights. He was calm, terrifyingly so. His eyes were bright with a feverish intensity. This was the same man from the Stargazer, the gambler, the madman, the genius. In that moment, Kalen made a decision. He had observed this anomaly, this rogue variable. Now, he would unleash it. "Do it," Kalen said, his voice a calm, steady anchor in the storm. "Helm, engineering, you have your orders. Execute on the first mate's command." A collective intake of breath could be heard over the comm. The Admiral was ceding command in a crisis to the strange newcomer. Elian didn't hesitate. He took control, his voice crisp and precise, rattling off a string of commands for shield modulation, engine output, and plasma venting. The ship groaned, shuddered, and then tilted violently as the helm officer followed his insane instructions, steering them into the maw of the beast. The viewscreen became a nauseating swirl of warped starlight. The ship screamed, the sound of tearing metal, a physical blow. Red lights flashed across the bridge. The artificial gravity sputtered, and for a moment they were weightless. Elian held onto his console, his knuckles white. He could feel the immense, crushing force of the singularity, a physical pressure on his entire body. It was an agony. And in that agony, something inside him snapped. The suppressants, already strained, failed. It wasn't a leak. It was a dam break, a flood. His scent, his true scent, unmuted and raw, poured out of him, a tidal wave of ozone, nightshade, and pure, undiluted Omega distress. It filled the small ready room, potent and overwhelming, a scent of terror, but also of defiance, a scent of a storm breaking. The ship gave one final, violent lurch, and then they were through. The viewscreen stabilized, showing the singularity shrinking behind them as they were flung out into clear space. The alarm ceased. A ragged cheer went up from the bridge crew over the comm. They had survived. They were alive. Elian sagged against his console, trembling, the adrenaline draining away, leaving him weak and exposed. The room was thick with his scent. There was no hiding it. There was no taking it back. He looked up and met Admiral Vance's eyes. The Admiral was staring at him, his face utterly devoid of expression. But his grey eyes were wide with a stark, undeniable realization. The secret was out. The lie was over. The silence that descended upon the ready room was more profound than the absence of sound. It was a vacuum, heavy and suffocating, where the only thing that moved was the scent, Elian's scent. It clung to the air, to the bulkheads, an undeniable, fragrant confession. Ozone and nightshade, fear and defiance, Omega. He could see the knowledge dawn in the Admiral's eyes, the flicker of disbelief hardening into cold, absolute certainty. The mask of the unreadable commander finally cracked, not with anger, but with something far more complex, something that looked almost like shock. Elian pushed himself off the console, his legs unsteady. The trembling was not just from adrenaline anymore. It was from sheer, gut-wrenching terror. He had failed. After a lifetime of vigilance, of denial, of chemical warfare against his own body, he had been undone by a twist of physics and a moment of desperation. He braced himself for the explosion, the shouting, the disgust, the call to the master-at-arms. He braced himself to be called a liar, a deviant, a contamination. Instead, Vance remained perfectly still, his gaze locked on Elian. The alphas on the bridge, celebrating their survival, were oblivious. their senses not as attuned, the scent filtered by the time it reached them. But here, in this enclosed space, it was as loud as a scream. The Admiral took a slow, deliberate breath, and Elian saw his nostrils flare almost imperceptibly. He was cataloguing it, analyzing it, this piece of data that shattered every assumption he had ever held. "Get out," Vance said. His voice was dangerously quiet, a low, controlled rumble that was more menacing than any shout. It was not directed at Elian. He pressed the comm button on the central table. "Bridge, status report." The voice of the new helm officer, an alpha named Rorik, came back, still giddy with relief. "Admiral, we're clear of the Singularity's gravitational field. Minor hull breaches on decks 7 and 9, but structural integrity is holding. No casualties reported. First Mate Verus." "Admiral, he saved us all." "Resume course to the Citadel," Vance commanded, his voice unchanged. "And clear this channel. Command staff only." He switched off the comm. The silence returned, thicker than before. He looked at Elian, and for the first time, Elian saw not a commander looking at a subordinate, but an alpha looking at an omega. There was a raw, primal awareness in his eyes that stripped Elian bare, peeling back the uniform and the rank and leaving him feeling utterly exposed. "My quarters," Vance said. The words clipped. "Now." It was not a request. He strode to the door, and it hissed open. He walked out without a backward glance, the set of his shoulders rigid. Elian stood frozen for a moment, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to find the deepest, darkest corner of the ship and hide. But there was nowhere to run. He was on a warship in the middle of the void, and he had just revealed his deepest secret to the one man in the universe most certain to destroy him. For it, with leaden feet, he followed. The walk through the corridors was a blur. Crew members, busy with damage control, nodded to him with newfound respect. He was the hero of the hour, the man who had saved the ship. The irony was a bitter acid in his throat. They were saluting a ghost, a fiction. The Admiral's quarters were located in the command tower, the most secure section of the ship. The door slid open to reveal a space that was as Spartan and controlled as the man himself. It was larger than Elian's cabin, but furnished with the same minimalist severity. A bed, neatly made, a desk with a single data slate on it, and a large viewport showing the same hypnotic swirl of hyperspace as the ready room. Vance was standing by the viewport, his back to the door. He didn't turn when Elian entered. The door hissed shut, sealing them in. The air here was still, and Elian's scent, which clung to his uniform, began to permeate this space as well. It felt like a desecration of a holy site. "For 22 years, Vance began, his voice a low, conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than rage. "I have served the hegemony. I have built my career, my entire life, on a foundation of discipline, order, and control. I believe in the system. I believe in its strength. I believe that every component has its place, and that deviation from that order leads to weakness, to chaos." He turned slowly, his grey eyes pinning Elian to the spot. "You are the embodiment of chaos. You are a lie walking through the corridors of my ship." Elian said nothing. There was nothing to say. The accusation was true. "How?" Vance asked, taking a step forward. "The medical screenings are foolproof. The genetic markers are absolute. How did you do it?" "My records were altered at birth," Elian said, his voice quiet but steady. He would not grovel. He would not beg. He had made his choices. a sympathetic doctor. A beta designation was entered into the system. The suppressants. I've been taking them since I was 13. 13, Vance repeated, the word tasting like poison. You have spent your entire life in defiance of your own biology, in defiance of the natural order. Why? The question hung in the air between them. Why? For the stars, for the right to stand on a bridge and command, not be cloistered away and protected, for the chance to be judged on the content of his mind, not the nature of his body, for the simple, desperate desire to be more than what the universe had decreed he should be. Because I believe my worth is not determined by my designation, Admiral, Elian said, lifting his chin. It was a small act of defiance, but it was all he had left. Vance took another step, closing the distance between them until he was standing directly in front of Elian. He was taller, broader. Elian had to tilt his head back to meet his gaze. The Admiral's scent was subtle, suppressed by years of military discipline. But it was there, clean, sharp, like cold iron and winter air. It was the scent of absolute, unshakable control. And it was calling to something deep inside Elian, a primal instinct that his failing suppressants could no longer contain. Your worth, Vance said, his voice a low growl, is that of a liar, a fraud. You have jeopardized the security of this vessel and this crew with your deception. You are a vulnerability, exactly as I have always said. He reached out, not to strike, but to touch. His fingers brushed against the collar of Elian's uniform, a shockingly intimate gesture in the charged atmosphere. Elian flinched, a full-body tremor he couldn't control. Every regulation demands that I have you confined, that I strip you of your rank and turn you over to the hegemony for reprocessing. Elian's breath hitched. Reprocessing. A clinical term for psychological and biological reconditioning, for being broken down and remade into a docile, compliant Omega, all ambition and intellect scoured away. It was his deepest fear. But, Vance continued, his eyes searching Elian's, looking for something. Regulation did not save this ship an hour ago. Logic did not save it. A reckless, desperate 17% gamble by a biological vulnerability saved it. His hand dropped away. He stepped back, putting a sliver of distance between them. The conflict in his face was stark, a war between a lifetime of conviction and the undeniable truth standing before him. You are confined to these quarters until further notice. You will speak to no one. You will see no one. I will bring you your meals myself. We have not reached the citadel yet, and I have not yet decided what to do with the chaos you have brought aboard my ship. He turned and walked out, the door sealing with a final, definitive hiss. Elian was left alone in the Admiral's Spartan room, a prisoner in his commander's personal space, surrounded by the scent of cold iron and his own traitorous perfume of a storm finally broken. He sank onto the edge of the bed, the first sob of his adult life catching in his throat, silent and agonizing. The hours that followed bled into one another, a timeless grey expanse of confinement. Elian remained in the Admiral's quarters, a ghost haunting a space that was not his own. The room was a reflection of its owner, austere, functional, devoid of personal touches save for a single, leather-bound book on the nightstand, a collection of ancient Terran war poetry. The viewport was his only connection to the outside world, the endless hypnotic flow of hyperspace, a mirror of his own suspended state. He was in limbo, caught between his past life as a lie and a future that was terrifyingly uncertain.
His body, free from suppressants for the first time in over a decade, was a foreign country. A low-grade heat simmered under his skin. His senses were sharper, almost painfully so. He could hear the faint, distant hum of the ship's engines, feel the subtle vibrations in the deck, and smell the trace elements in the recycled air, and his own scent. It was a constant presence now, a part of him he could no longer deny. It filled the room, a complex aroma of rain on wild things, of fear and a strange budding resilience. True to his word, Vance was his sole contact. 3 times a day, the door would hiss open and the Admiral would enter, placing a tray of food on the desk without a word. He never stayed. He never looked at Elian for more than a fleeting, unreadable glance. Their interactions were silent, transactional, yet charged with a tension that was almost unbearable. Elian watched him during these brief intrusions, cataloguing the rigid set of his shoulders, the deep-etched lines of strain around his eyes. The Iron Admiral was at war with himself, and Elian was the battlefield. On the 3rd day, Vance broke the silence. He entered with the evening meal tray and, instead of leaving, he closed the door and stood before it, as if guarding the exit. "The senior staff is asking questions," he said, his voice flat. "They want to know why their savior is being kept under lock and key. I have told them you are undergoing a medical evaluation for post-traumatic stress. It is a temporary solution." Elian sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped in his lap. He had not spoken in 3 days. His voice felt rusty. "And the permanent solution, Admiral?" Vance walked over to the viewport, staring out at the swirling chaos of warp travel. "I have reviewed your service record again, and the logs from the Stargazer. I have run simulations of both the pirate engagement and the encounter with the Singularity. In every simulation where your unconventional solutions were not implemented, the result was total loss of the vessel." He turned to face Elian, his grey eyes intense. "By every metric of performance, you are the most competent first mate I have ever had. By every metric of biology, you are an impossibility." "The two are not mutually exclusive," Elian whispered, the words tasting strange on his tongue. "My entire worldview is built on the premise that they are," Vance countered, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "Order, predictability, strength. An Omega's biology is oriented toward emotion, instinct, cyclical vulnerabilities. It is the antithesis of the discipline required to command a warship." "Perhaps your definition of discipline is too narrow," Elian dared to say, a spark of his old defiance returning. "You see instinct as a weakness. I see it as a source of data my conscious mind might overlook. It was not logic alone that solved those problems, Admiral. It was a feeling, a sense of the physics involved. It was the 17% that you cannot quantify." Vance stared at him, a long, searching look. He crossed the room and stopped in front of Elian, much as he had done that first day. But this time the dynamic had shifted. Elian was no longer just a subordinate caught in a lie. He was a living, breathing paradox that Vance could not dismiss. "When your scent filled the ready room," Vance said, his voice lowering, "what I felt was not disgust." The admission seemed to cost him something. It was distracting, a threat to cohesion, a threat to my own focus. How is a crew supposed to function under fire when their senses are being assaulted by such a potent biological signal? The same way they function despite the constant pheromonal broadcast of alpha aggression and dominance
that permeates every bridge in the fleet. Elian shot back, his voice gaining strength. We are taught that alpha scents are the smell of command, of safety. We are taught that omega scents are the smell of weakness, of temptation. We are not taught that they are simply different. One is not inherently more distracting than the other. It is the meaning we have been conditioned to assign to them. It was the most he had ever said to the Admiral, the most honest he had ever been with anyone in a position of authority. He was laying his entire philosophy, his entire reason for being, bare. He expected dismissal, anger, a cold rebuttal. Instead, Vance was silent. He seemed to be truly listening, processing the words, turning them over in his brilliant, tactical mind. He was analyzing the flaw in the system Elian had presented, and for the first time he seemed to be considering that the flaw might be real. The Citadel is 2 days away, Vance said finally, changing the subject, but not the intensity of his gaze. When we arrive, I will have to make a full report. I will have to account for the loss of my first mate and the appointment of his replacement. I will have to account for you. The unspoken question hung in the air. What would he say? Would he expose Elian, uphold the law, and restore the order he so cherished? Or would he protect him, becoming complicit in the lie, and in doing so, acknowledge the truth of Elian's worth? "What do you want, Verus?" Vance asked, the question soft, almost gentle. It was the first time he had used Elian's name without his rank. Elian looked up at him, at this powerful, conflicted man who held his entire future in his hands. What did he want? He wanted to stay. He wanted to stand on the bridge of the Ethelgard, not as a lie, but as himself. He wanted to serve, to use his mind, to prove that what he was not a weakness. He wanted the stars. And looking at the Admiral, a new, terrifying and unspoken want began to bloom in the hollow space in his chest. "I want," Elian said, his voice barely a whisper, "to do my job." Vance held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, sharp nod. "Then you had better get some rest, first mate. You're back on duty tomorrow at 600. He turned and left without another word. The door hissed shut, but this time it did not sound like the ceiling of a prison. It sounded like an opening. Elian looked down at his trembling hands, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt a flicker of something he had long since suppressed, along with everything else. Hope. Returning to the bridge was like stepping into a different world. The news of his reinstatement had preceded him, a quiet directive from the Admiral that had rippled through the command crew. When Elian stepped onto the command deck at 0600 sharp, his uniform immaculate, the tense silence he had first been met with was replaced by something else. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was a grudging, palpable respect. Heads nodded. The new helm officer, Rorik, even offered a small, hesitant smile. They saw him not as an outsider, but as the man who had saved them. They did not know his secret. They only knew his strength. But Elian knew, and Vance knew, and that shared knowledge created an invisible, unbreakable tether between them. The air on the bridge was different now, charged with a new kind of tension. Elian took his station, his senses, now unmuted, taking in the environment in overwhelming detail. He could smell the faint metallic tang of the Alpha Crew's pheromones, the clean scent of the Admiral standing at his command post, the ozone from the consoles. He filtered it, compartmentalized it, turning the sensory overload into a stream of useful data. He was more aware, more connected to the ship and its crew than ever before. He could feel the subtle shift in the bridge's atmosphere when a sensor alert proved to be a false alarm, the collective, unspoken sigh of relief. He could sense the fatigue in the communications officer's voice before she even reported it. It was like a new sense, an empathic overlay to his tactical awareness. He did not let it show. On the surface, he was the same cold, efficient first mate. He delivered his reports in the same clipped monotone. He moved with the same precision, but underneath, he was fundamentally changed. He was whole. The Admiral, too, was different. He was still the same demanding, perfectionist commander, but there was a new quality to his attention. He watched Elian, not with suspicion, but with a kind of intense, analytical curiosity. He started soliciting Elian's opinion, not just on tactical matters, but on crew morale, on long-term strategic planning. He was testing not just the officer, but the Omega, trying to understand the newfound sense Elian had described. Their debates in the ready room became more frequent, more intense. They were no longer just about strategy. They were about philosophy. They argued about the nature of strength, the definition of order, the role of instinct in a technologically advanced military. The system is designed to eliminate variables, Vance argued one night, the holographic map of the sector glowing between them. To create soldiers who are predictable, reliable. Your very existence is a testament to the failure of that system. Or it is a testament to the system's flawed premise, Elian countered, more confident now in these intellectual spars. The system assumes that uniformity equals strength. It doesn't. It creates brittleness. A fleet of identical thinkers is predictable, easily countered. True strength lies in diversity, in adaptability, in the 17% solution that no one else can see. Vance looked at him, his expression thoughtful. You believe your designation gives you a tactical advantage. I believe that every part of who I am contributes to my tactical ability, Elian corrected. My mind, my training, my instincts. To deny one part of myself is to fight with one hand tied behind my back. For years, I fought with both hands tied. I am just now learning what it is to be free. The unspoken subject of their own dynamic hung heavy in the air between them. The Admiral, the ultimate alpha, the embodiment of the system, and Elian, the Omega, the flaw in that system. And yet, on the bridge, they worked together with a synergy that was breathtaking. Vance's decisive command and Elian's intuitive insights created a command pairing of unparalleled effectiveness. They anticipated each other's thoughts, finished each other's sentences in the heat of a simulated drill. The crew saw it, felt it. The bridge of the Ethel Guard had never run more smoothly. Their fragile new reality was shattered on the last day before their arrival at the Citadel. A Priority 1, encrypted message arrived from Fleet Command. It was for the Admiral's eyes only. Vance took it in his ready room. Elian, on duty on the bridge, felt a prickle of unease. He watched the sealed door of the ready room, a sense of foreboding settling over him. An hour later, Vance emerged. His face was like a death mask, carved from ice. The air around him was frigid. He walked to the center of the bridge, and the entire crew fell silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. I have just received new orders from High Command, Vance announced, his voice devoid of all emotion. Our pirate faction has been identified. They call themselves the Liberated Fleet. They are not pirates. They are secessionists, and their ranks are filled with deviants. He paused, and his eyes found Elian's. Runaways, deserters, Omegas who have refused reprocessing, betas who believe in their cause. The word Omegas dropped onto the bridge like a bomb. The crew shifted, murmuring. Elian felt the blood drain from his face. Their flagship is the Stargazer, Vance continued, his voice dropping lower. They have repaired it, retrofitted it, and its captain is a former hegemony officer who was discharged for advocating for Omega rights. Captain Eva Rostova, Aris, the other survivors. They had joined the rebellion. They had been part of it all along. The attack wasn't to draw the fleet out. It was to recruit him. They had seen his talent, his frustration, and had tried to give him a way out, and he had led the hegemony right to them. High Command has declared this faction a primary threat to the stability of the hegemony, Vance said, his voice like cracking ice. Our new orders are to engage and destroy, no quarter and no survivors. He looked directly at Elian, his gaze a physical blow. The unspoken message was clear. He was ordering Elian to help him hunt down and kill people who were fighting for his own freedom. People who were, in essence, just like him. The final, most cruel test had arrived. He had to choose. The uniform he wore, the man he was beginning to trust, or the cause that was written in his very blood. The Aethelguard dropped out of warp space into a scene of beautiful, terrible carnage. The liberated fleet, a ragtag collection of retrofitted freighters and stolen patrol boats, was arrayed around a small, uninhabited moon. At their center was the Stargazer, its familiar, battered hull now bristling with added weaponry. They were hopelessly outmatched by the sleek, predatory form of the Aethelguard, but they held their formation with a defiance that was almost painful to watch. On the bridge, the atmosphere was electric with the prelude to battle. The crew moved with grim efficiency, their faces set, the time for questions and doubts over. Now was the time for obedience. Elian stood at his station, his insides a knot of ice. He could see Captain Rostova's face in his mind, her weary, kind eyes. He saw Aris, earnest and terrified. They were not monsters. They were dreamers, and he was about to give the order to execute them. "They are hailing us," the comms officer announced, on an open channel. "Put it on screen," Vance commanded. The face of Eva Rostova filled the main view screen. She looked older, more tired, but her eyes burned with a fire Elian had never seen before. "Admiral Vance," she said, her voice steady, "we are not your enemy. We are claiming our right to exist, free from the hegemony's persecution. We ask only for safe passage." "You are a declared enemy of the hegemony," Vance replied, his voice cold and formal. "You have stolen fleet property and incited rebellion. Surrender your vessels and your crews, and you will be treated according to the Articles of War." "There is no justice for our kind in your articles, Admiral," Rostova said, a sad smile touching her lips. "We will not surrender." Her eyes shifted, finding the camera that she knew would be focused on the bridge. "Elian, if you can hear me, we did this for you. We saw what you were, what you could be. Don't let them turn you into a weapon against your own people. Join us." A collective gasp went through the bridge. Every eye turned to Elian, his secret, broadcast for all to hear. He stood frozen, exposed, the weight of 100 pairs of eyes pressing down on him. He was no longer a hero. He was a traitor, a deviant, an Omega. He looked at Vance. The Admiral's face was unreadable, a perfect mask of command. But Elian could see the storm in his eyes. This was the moment of truth, the system or the anomaly, order or chaos. "First mate," Vance said, his voice dangerously soft. "Target their lead vessel's weapon systems. Disable them." It was a test, a final, brutal test. Was he loyal to the uniform or to his designation? Could he fire on his own people? Elian's hand moved toward the tactical console. His fingers hovered over the controls. He could feel the pulse in his wrist, the heat in his blood. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a choice, waiting to be made. He looked from Rostova's pleading face on the screen to Vance's unyielding one beside him. He saw two different kinds of order. One rigid and brittle, built on exclusion. The other, messy and desperate, built on hope. And he realized that Vance was not just testing him. He was offering him a way out. Disable them, not destroy them. It was a subtle distinction, a sliver of mercy in a merciless order. It was the Admiral's own 17% solution. In that moment, Elian understood. Vance was not going to make the choice for him. He was forcing Elian to make it for himself, and in doing so, to define himself, once and for all. "No," Elian said, his voice ringing out in the shocked silence of the bridge. He turned away from his console to face the Admiral fully. "I will not." The mutiny was quiet, bloodless, and utterly absolute. As Elian spoke, a schism cracked the bridge. The helm officer, Rorik, a staunch traditionalist, moved to draw his sidearm. Before he could clear the holster, the beta science officer at the next station had him in a sleeper hold, her face a mask of grim determination. Two other alphas, loyalists to the old way, were similarly subdued by a surprising number of betas and even a few younger alphas who had come to respect Elian. The bridge crew was divided, not by rank, but by ideology, and it was clear that Elian's quiet competence and Vance's tacit approval had won more hearts than the hegemony's rigid dogma. Through it all, Vance did not move. He simply watched, his grey eyes taking in the silent, efficient coup happening on his own bridge. He watched as Elian walked to the center of the command deck, his posture no longer that of a subordinate, but of a leader. "Admiral Vance has given us a lawful order to engage," Elian said, his voice calm and clear, projecting a confidence he didn't feel. "But I believe that order is based on a flawed premise. The people on those ships are not a threat to the hegemony. They are a symptom of its sickness. To destroy them is to destroy the hope of a cure." He looked at Vance. "You taught me to analyze all variables, Admiral, to choose the option with the highest probability of a successful outcome. Annihilating that fleet will create martyrs. It will fuel their rebellion, turning a small faction into a galactic war. The most logical course of action is to let them go." It was the Admiral's own logic, turned back on him, the cold, hard calculus of command. Vance's face was a stony mask, but a flicker of something, pride, respect, danced in his eyes. He had unleashed the rogue variable, and it had just rewritten the entire equation. "You are relieved of command, First Mate," Vance said, his voice formal, for the record, for the log that would be scrutinized by High Command. He looked around the bridge at the loyalists being held, at the rebels who had taken their stations. His perfect, orderly bridge was in chaos, and at the center of it was the Omega who had started it all. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was almost imperceptible, but Elian saw it. It was permission. It was abdication. It was, in its own way, a choice. Elian turned to the comm station. "Captain Rostova, this is First Mate Veras. Power down your weapons, but maintain your current position. We are not going to fire." A choked sound of disbelief and relief came from the view screen. "Elian, what are you doing?" "Choosing the 17% solution, Captain," he said. He turned to the helm. "Plot a course away from the liberated fleet. Take us to the edge of the system. Maximum sublight speed." The ship turned, its powerful engines pushing it away from the conflict, away from the battle that never was. The ragtag fleet of rebels held their position, watching the mighty warship retreat. It was an impossible image, the wolf turning away from the sheep. On the bridge of the Ethelgard, a new order was being forged in the quiet aftermath. Elian stood beside the command chair, where Vance still sat, a silent, observing king on a chessboard that had been flipped. The tension had not dissipated, but it had changed, transformed from the threat of violence into the heavy weight of consequence. They had committed treason. They had defied high command. There was no going back. As the Stargazer and its fleet finally warped away, disappearing into the safety of the void, Elian looked at the empty space where they had been. He had saved them. He had saved himself. But he had doomed the man who had, against all odds, given him the chance. He turned to Vance. "Admiral, Kalen." Using his given name felt like crossing a final, unbreakable line. "What happens now?" Kalen looked up at him, his grey eyes clear. The internal war was over. He had chosen a side. He had chosen the anomaly. "Now," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone, "we find a new chart." The words were simple, but their meaning was immense. They were no longer part of the hegemony. They were a rogue variable, a ship without a nation, a crew united not by regulation, but by a shared act of rebellion. They were free, and they were utterly, completely alone. Kalen stood up, the movement full of a newfound lightness. He walked to Elian, stopping in front of him. The bridge crew, his crew, and now Elian's, watched in silence. He reached out and gently, deliberately, rested his hand on Elian's shoulder. It was not the touch of a commander or an alpha asserting dominance. It was the touch of a partner. "Omegas don't belong on ships, Verus," Kalen said, his voice soft enough for only Elian to hear, a ghost of his old conviction in the words. A small, sad smile touched his lips. "They belong at the helm." Elian looked into the Iron Admiral's eyes and saw not a commander, not a legend, but a man who had been willing to let his entire world break in order to build a new one, a man who had seen the flaw in the system and chosen the person instead. In the quiet of the bridge, surrounded by their uncertain future, Elian reached up and placed his hand over Kalen's. The contact was electric, a promise of a new kind of order, a new kind of strength. The future was a blank, uncharted star map, but for the first time, looking out at the endless, beautiful void, Elian felt like he was finally home.